even as early as Alexander Fleming's days, when he was receiving his Nobel Prize, in his talk he said that be careful with these very valuable medications. If it is not used properly, you will get resistance.
Okay, so we read a lot about possible problems of antibiotics in food, but I think we ought to ask what that actually means and what the problems are or might be. And are they real, or are they potential problems? Do people add antibiotics to food? Why would they do that? We need to discuss where antibiotics come in connection with food, and see if we can explore that and come up with some answers. So I should start by saying that my name is Vivian Moses, and I am by experience a biochemist and microbiologist. I'm now visiting Professor of Biotechnology at King's College London, and my expert who is going to answer these questions is Professor Oya Alpar, who is Professor of Pharmaceutics at the School of Pharmacy at University College London. So we're both London professors, emeritus I should say for both of us, and we will start off. Okay, so let's ask the first question, how come antibiotics are involved at all with food?
I know, it is ironic, isn't it? You would think, but it is one of the biggest realities nowadays that we discuss, how the antibiotics get into food, and do we really consume antibiotics as antibiotics? Let's start to see what antibiotics are.
Absolutely.
Antibiotics are actually chemicals that kill organisms, microorganisms, especially in our case, we will be talking about bacteria, killing the bacteria.
Because they don't attack, they have nothing to do with viruses, do they?
Exactly. That is another point that consumers and the public should be aware, that they have no resemblance to viruses. Therefore, because of their natural biological differences between bacteria and virus, antibiotics would not affect the virus. Antibiotics kill or disabilitate the bacteria so that it's killed, or becomes so that it cannot multiply and it cannot give any harm to the body or the organism it is residing in.
Can I ask you just one small question at this point? Where do these come from? Are these natural products? Let's say they're made out there in the soil or something, or are they entirely, I mean, I realise that of course they're made in factories for commercial purposes, yes, but were they originally designed by people or what?
Oh yes, no, it is antibiotics actually. Nobody invented antibiotics. Mm-hmm. It was discovered. Yep. It was already out there in the nature, and by serendipitous experiment of Fleming just came across that a mold was stopping a bacteria that he was interested in looking at, stopping its growth. Mm-hmm. And that was penicillin. That is how it was discovered as early as 1928. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, once it was discovered, then people start looking at into nature again, whether they can find similar. It's almost like an exudate, yes, coming out from a mold. Whether they are produced by bacteria. Bacteria, they were here long before we were, and in order for them to survive, they produce chemicals like this. And once we learn the tricks from bacteria, some of them are very difficult to produce biologically, and they started synthesizing modifications of that in order to be able to synthesize in the laboratory. But still, many antibiotics are actually fermented from the bacteria themselves. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Fine, thank you. Okay, so you've told us what they are. And now, how did they get into farming?
As early as 1940s, soon after the practice of using antibiotics in the human infections, it was discovered that it's doing something to animals as well when they started giving to animals as well too. And they found out that the mechanism of it is not really known as yet. They started putting these antibiotics willy-nilly into the feeds of the animals.
Okay, so let me get this clear. For human use, antibiotics were valuable in a medical sense to help to cure infections.
Yes.
But this was not the way you're talking about them being used for animals. The animals were not infected.
I mean, it is used, it still is used for animals in three ways. For therapeutic.
Yeah. As for humans.
As for humans. When a cattle or a chicken, they get infection, they become poorly, they can be given antibiotics. But it didn't stop there. Initially, they never thought that it was going to be a problem. And they also started giving for preventative reasons, in order when the animals started being produced as industrial production, having 20,000 chickens or 10,000 pigs in a confined space, when they are living next to each other and stepping onto each other's waste, it was a way of stopping the infections, like in a children's nursery. When children, lots of them, we see lots of disease coming into the household from the nurseries.
So it was stopping the cross infections?
Yes, they are very close to each other, and they live in a very unhygienic environment. That was actually helping to the food producers, farmers, to grow their animal faster and to take it into the slaughterhouse in a shorter period of time.
That was because they were not getting ill, because they were healthier?
Yes, they were doing it. Even there was no illness within that animal society.
Okay, let's get some of this stuff clear. How was the antibiotic being administered to the animal? Was it in the feed?
Yes, it was. It was just put into the feed, and when animal was consuming their food, they would consume antibiotics.
Now, when antibiotics are used therapeutically in humans, sometimes it's used by mouth.
Yes.
But sometimes it's injected.
Yes.
Presumably the injected antibiotic is because if you fed it by mouth for that condition, it wouldn't reach it properly, so you have to inject it.
It's generally taken orally. In other words, through mouth, which would go into the digestive tract, and then will get absorbed into the other parts of the body. So
it's an effective way of administering antibiotics therapeutically for humans to feed them, because it goes into the bloodstream and it gets distributed and finds the site where
Yes.
And presumably the same sort of reasoning goes on for animals as well.
Yes, that was put into for feeding purposes or for prophylactic purposes. It was also put into the waters.
Yeah.
But in the case of treatment, they are given intramuscularly to the animals.
When an animal has been identified.
Yes, identified with an infectious illness, which suspected of being a bacterial infection.
Okay. So then this became, what, a widespread phenomenon of putting antibiotics into animal feed?
I'm afraid so. Although even as early as Alexander Fleming's days, when he was receiving his Nobel Prize, in his talk he said that be careful with these very valuable medications. If it is not used properly, you will get resistance. But everybody ignored this. It's a very well-known phenomenon. We get adapted to our environment and bacteria gets adapted to their environment. Therefore, they will one day start resisting.
One question before we come to resistance,
Okay.
and that is whereabouts in the world was this use of antibiotics prevalent? Presumably in the industrialized countries. Presumably in the poorer countries, developing countries, people were not in a position to provide antibiotics. And anyhow, the animals were grazing out in the fields.
Yes, it's
So it's an industrial farming phenomenon,
exactly,
predominantly.
Exactly, and predominantly also in America. In America, 80% of the antibiotics. 80% of antibiotics used for livestock and food animals is given as feed. But it is only 40%, luckily, in our country.
Our country being Britain?
Our country being Britain.
What about other European countries?
Other European countries. This debate goes on and off on the US media, European media, and worldwide. WHO is very much interested, World Health Organization, very much interested in this this antibiotic usage as in the feed animals. Now, once we started seeing some signs of bacteria being cleverer than us, Europe started thinking twice about usage of antibiotic in the feed. We have Scandinavian countries, especially Denmark. They were the first to cut out the use of antibiotics from the feed.
By law?
Yes. And before general European countries, they decided it was by law again. In Europe, it was banned by 2006, not using in animal.
That was throughout the European Union?
Yes, throughout the European Union. There's an in spite of that.
Okay, now let's ask this question. What are they afraid of? Why did they want to stop it? And why did the Americans not want to stop it?
Yes. I mean, it's a very complex problem. Why did they want to stop it? There was a very reputable evidence coming from a scientific paper, which Danish followed that after reading that there's a link between the using antibiotics in animals and especially animal feed and developing resistance in human beings.
Humans?
Yes, the bacteria that infected human beings becoming resistant to the many. It started off with one or two antibiotics. MRSA is the very well-known one, but then it sort of developed into avalanche, into many other resistances were coming along.
I mean, if this happens in animals, how do humans get affected? Because presumably milk is pasteurized, and I don't know what happens when you make all the other dairy products, but presumably they're treated in various ways, and the meat is cooked. So how does this resistance get from animals into humans?
Yes.
Or how does the risk of it get into humans?
Okay. Now, we talked about the antibiotics being in the animal feed. In other words, they consume it, and the bacteria in the animal internal gut system affected by the antibiotic, because antibiotic kills bacteria. And but bacteria population is a population like us. Some of them are more resilient to environmental stresses.
Naturally so.
Naturally so. can come from their genes, and because they are mixed bunch. Even if there is only one resistant bacteria remain in the gut of an animal, then because they are very promiscuous, they will multiply the generations. Within 20 minutes you get millions and billions of, within 24 hours. they are bigger than any army. And of course they don't stay there.
No, but if the susceptible ones get killed by the but then of course the others have no competition. The resistant ones have no competition. And
exactly, they will flourish.
Yeah.
And then what they do, they are defecated with the feces of the animal, and then environmental issues come into place. How in the farms the waste is handled. And farmers or people working in the production, looking after these animals, it's first transferred into the environment, into the water through the environment, and to the nearest human beings. And then, like that, it starts getting into human beings. Also, the meat we get from these. During and after slaughter, even if there is a couple of salmonella or E. coli left in the meat, that's why we ask everybody to cook their meat well. But then there is a possibility.
If you cook it properly, it's okay.
I mean, you can't really avoid. Yes, you think that it can be okay, but it's not, because it's not only in the meat. The irrigation, the water from the waste and getting into the water, irrigation, the vegetables we eat.
You mean the vegetables become infected because of the
irritation?
Because the bacteria getting into the environment.
And the best environment for a bacteria to grow is in the minimum antibacterial concentration, and these areas are getting less and less antimicrobial concentration. They grow, these bacteria start flourishing.
Okay, and I can see that as an important characteristic of this whole episode, this whole series of events, is the fact that you concentrated the resistant ones, because they are present anyway in the environment, but in small numbers, and by use of inadvisable perhaps use of antibiotics in animal feeds, you concentrate in the animal waste the resistant ones, which otherwise would be present in a far lower concentration and be less of a concern.
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment of what the problem is?
It is.
Yes, okay.
And then bugs are so clever. They only not themselves get the resistance. They pass away their resistance genes to the next bug. Yeah. It's like when you in the spy films or thriller crime films, you see that one's passing the suitcase to the another one without looking at each other's eyes. They pass their genes, and
but they do that anyway. They're constantly exchanging genes.
Yes.
All right. So I get the sense of where the problem arises and why it's a problem, and the administration then of the antibiotics. The source of the administration is the people who give the food to the bacteria. The decision is about whether to put antibiotics in or not. And I see what might happen to consumers if the antibiotics produce resistances in the animal's bacteria. Okay, so if someone is concerned about the use of antibiotics, and many people clearly are, what can one say to them about this whole problem?
Maybe so far it's understood that it's a very complex problem. What can we do about these problems? Again, I think one thing we need to make clearer, that sometimes the conception of the consumers, people on the street, as if through the meat we are getting antibiotics. The limits are set. There's always a control at the slaughterhouse and before packaging, whether any antibiotic residue, because they can be deadly, like in the case of penicillin poisoning or penicillin allergy.
Yes.
Therefore, there are tests. It's not the antibiotic per se in the meat or any other food material we buy. It is the bacteria that is passed on.
So apart from some people having allergies to antibiotics, the antibiotics themselves are not the problem. It's the effect they have on the microorganisms.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes. And what can we do?
Yes. What can
now throughout the world, because of this, it's a ticking bomb.
Yeah.
What is expected if we don't do anything? Consumers, physicians, governments, we will go back to the pre-antibiotic era where 43% of English population died before antibiotics from infections,
Yeah.
which are used to be curable.
You're envisaging a situation here, so if we're not careful with
Yeah.
the use of antibiotics, then the whole bacterial population will become resistant,
Exactly.
or more resistant, and
Yes.
that will pose a medical threat for us,
Yes.
because
yes.
our infections will not be curable by the use of antibiotics the way they are now.
Yes.
or have
Therefore, you know what we can do. We can question the food we are buying. We can ask for antibiotic-free, organic. Maybe everybody has their choice, but we can push the producers to use less and less antibiotic in their, even for treatment. There are farms that they never use antibiotics, but with the hygiene and the environment they bring in, they can still make profit, and they can produce good bacteria-free, antibiotic-free. Therefore, as a consumer, it is on our shoulders actually. We should be able to ask the questions in the restaurants when we go, where your meat is coming from, what sort of antibiotics or what sort of farms, and of course importantly imports.
Okay, but there's a cost in all this.
I know.
Presumably farmers are using antibiotics in feed because they get better production, or the cost of producing the animals is
Yes.
less, or whatever it is. And if you stop using them, then the cost of production will go up,
Yes.
and the price of the products will go up. So people have to consider, therefore, what they want to do about this. So do they want to
Yes.
take the risk with the antibiotics, or do
Yes.
they want to pay more for their food, particularly their meat and dairy products,
Yes.
perhaps?
Yes.
So that's a question for a wide democratic question for society in general.
It is, yet Lord Jim O'Neill, he made the calculation. He's an economist. He was asked by the previous Prime Minister, in the light of this is a ticking bomb, what will be the economical consequences of all these antibiotic resistance? And the Danish did their calculations. The price that we will pay will be higher, but not duplicated or triplicated of they are quite marginal. And I think we can pay this price rather than going to pay in 10 years when our children, grandchildren will no longer be treated when they have a scar on their face. They will have infection in the brain, or they will never be treated. I think it's a price it's worth paying.
So clearly I think this needs to be more widely understood, but
Yes.
also I suspect the analyses need to be more carefully done and more carefully publicised, so that people can understand, people in general can understand exactly what the issues are, what the consequences of taking various forms of action, no action or banning or whatever it may be, and what the consequences they will have. You say there is an economic modelling has taken place, and I haven't seen it, and I don't know therefore how controversial that might be, whether everybody accepts that economic analysis or whether there might be other ways of looking at the problem. But what you've done is to illustrate an important and interesting question which has medical and economic and therefore social consequences for all of us who use farm products, which is everybody, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, yes, yes.
Well, I think that gives us a much better idea of what the whole problem is, and you have indicated your views about this, and I'm a newcomer, so I'm remaining neutral until I have more information, being a safe scientist. But thank you very much. That was very helpful and very interesting, and I'm sure lots of people will find it so.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.